In the beginning, I think people were upset. But the time goes and you forgot about it more and more.
It was a place of pristine lakes and mountains. Northern Sweden, homeland of the original Scandinavian people, the Lapps, who have inhabited this land of wild splendor since ancient times. Lapland is remote, almost removed from the modern world's grubby grasp, but in recent years the lakes and forests have been threatened by progress. The once nomadic Lapps now drive Volvos and live in villages. Their once rich culture is hanging by a slender thread, its relationship to this legendary animal of the uplands. Oleg Olsen may be the last of a long line of reindeer men. His father oversees the large herds in this region. Oleg has been groomed to inherit this task since birth.
I have my living from the reindeer. The reindeer is the point of my life. Everything goes around. It's the base.
So the focal point of the Olsen's year is the annual fall herding, when generations of skill are enhanced by tools of modern technology. Modern technology helps these Lapps supplement their income, and modern technology has threatened to sever their last tie with the past, not in the form of these machines on the turf and tundra, but in the form of a power plant thousands of miles away. At Chernobyl. When Chernobyl's #1 reactor blew in a nuclear core explosion, it spewed radioactive cesium particles into the atmosphere. The strongest winds were blowing towards Scandinavia. Fallout reigned over much of Europe, but the earliest and most dangerous fell on Sweden, a country that, ironically, had just decided to phase out nuclear power. It was at one of Sweden's plants that Chernobyl's awful secret came to light.
We looked outside the plant and we saw that we had high levels of radioactivity on the ground outside, but we didn't hear anything from Soviet Union.
Before the day was out, the Soviets had admitted to the world's worst nuclear catastrophe. And in Sweden, what was once pristine was now poison. Only 14 people live in the tiny town of Krushen. Owe Ellison is one of them. His home sits on the lake that his family has fished from for generations. It may be decades before he can eat his catch again.
You can't understand the price of the feeling if you don't live here. The government can say, we pay you 1,000 Swedish kronor, or for example, but it isn't an economic problem. It is a feeling problem.
Many Swedes experienced grief and fear as Chernobyl's shadow passed over their lives.
It was so sad. This whole area, mountain area, was clean, and the water was clean. And then this came in, and you can't see it.
Smell it?
No. It's just there.
It hit you in the mornings when you woke up. Oh yes, it is true. It was nothing that you have dreamt. We had to keep the cows inside. The worst part was not to know how dangerous it was.
Throughout the years,
Swedish authorities didn't know exactly what the danger was either.
This was in one shot, and it fell down where it rained, and it didn't fall down much where it didn't rain.
Gunnar Bennison was faced with the difficult task of providing replies to questions that have no clear-cut answers. As Director of Radiation Protection for Sweden, it was his duty to recommend allowable levels of radiation exposure.
You just have a threat of something coming, and then you just throw out the number to use for a few days while you think. When we had done this thinking, we knew we had a very widespread contamination, which might involve all of the foods. And then we had to set a level which would give sufficient safety, even if all of the food was contaminated.
As the fallout rained, hotspots appeared in the upland grazing areas. The lichen that grows here acts as a sort of radioactive sponge, absorbing and retaining radioactive substances. Lichen is the mainstay of the reindeer diet.
There is very little that can be done in the reindeer breeding area.
So in the first fall after Chernobyl, over 70,000 of the reindeer brought to slaughter were declared unfit for human consumption. This was devastating to the Lapps, from the most isolated villagers to their leader.
Of course, you have those thoughts about where this should end and what it means for yourself and the people around you. And of course, you worry.
This Chernobyl thing is real bad. We don't know for how long the cesium will contaminate our land, maybe 15 or 20 years. I've been working my whole life as a reindeer farmer, and it's all destroyed, and that feels so damn bad.
We don't know if it is safe to eat this meat. People talk so much about how dangerous cesium is, but I feel terrible about throwing this meat away.
It is very hard for us to figure out another way of making a living. This is what we are born to do. If we don't have the reindeer to raise and herd, then our culture will die.
Centuries of persecution have impoverished the Lapps. Their plight is similar to that of Native Americans. So the Swedish government supports the Lapps and reimburses them for contaminated reindeer. So far, Chernobyl has cost the Swedes $600 million. And by the time the next reindeer slaughter came around, authorities had rethought their safety measures. They raised the level of cesium contamination considered safe by 500%.
1 year later, we could see that not all of the food was contaminated to very high levels. So obviously there was no need for such a very strict measure, and then it could be changed.
Gunnar Bengtsson is worried about the costs. He doesn't want to spend too much money, and that's why they put the levels higher. And we have the option of eating or not eating.
All these things are political decisions, aren't they, in the end? What you're going to do? You've had this accident, you've got this meat contaminated. Are you going to say that it's all got to be destroyed and then the government's got to come in with enormous compensations and so on? Or are you going to, well, let it ride at some level? They can't know the end results of this. They simply don't know the end results of this. But they've obviously just set the limit there. It's, you've picked the figure out of the air, haven't you? I would think it was just a guess.
Dr. Alice Stewart has been studying the effects of low-level radiation exposure for 40 years, ever since man entered the nuclear age. And she maintains that science is still only guessing, while each year more people are exposed. She worries about the Lapps.
It's a high dose. It's a great deal much higher than it ought to be. And any increase is going to increase the risk of cancers, and these will be body burdens that these people will carry for the rest of their lives. So it's a very big dose. I would have said that it was rather alarming.
The risk of late cancer from the radioactive cesium people have in their bodies, the risk from this corresponds to the smoking of 1 cigarette per year.
Many Swedes, the Lapps especially, were pleased when the government raised the allowable limits for contamination.
I don't feel any worry for the future now, because we're back in business now.
The reindeer feeding grounds around Oleg Olsson's town of Tarnaby receive moderately high doses of radiation. Here, the annual reindeer roundup provides a crucial boost to the state's sustained economy. Last year, the season after Chernobyl, was a disaster. Over 90% of the meat was deemed too contaminated to eat. This year, with the levels set higher, most of the meat could be marketed, and spirits soared at the social event of the year. Even Oleg's father, the old reindeer boss, was able to joke about what he feels was only a passing disaster.
But one thing of this Chernobyl accident is that the reindeer and the reindeer meat has been known all over the world. So that's one of the positive things we have.
Och vi har ju ätit som vanligt I fjol även om det var 10 000 becquerel. Så har vi varit rädda för det. Så det, och det där har ju finns ju I markerna sen förut så det väl inget nytt.
Yeah, he says the meat is okay. It's just scientific. He says the meat is no good for human food. The scientists were saying that it would take 10-20 years to get the reindeer free from radiation. But now this year, the first slaughter we have it was only 3 reindeer, so the radiation was too high.
Owe Oma and hundreds of pragmatic Lapps like him ignored the warnings of the authorities and continued eating contaminated meat. The effects of not heeding the warnings are beginning to show in Sweden's radiation monitoring and research program, the most extensive ever undertaken. This post-Chernobyl effort is allowing scientists to study the long-term effects of internally absorbed radiation for the first time.
There are no safe levels, so you can't say that it's not dangerous, but the risk is quite low. There will be a few cancers from this. Nobody really knows.
In fact, the Swedish government has made the assumption, based on contested Hiroshima and Nagasaki studies, that Chernobyl will ultimately result in 2 additional cancer deaths per every 100,000 Swedes. Alice Stewart calls that assumption, like most about the health effects of radiation exposure, an uneducated, over-conservative guess.
You can straight away multiply it by 10, probably 20, and I suspect that it will come out, it's probably much higher. Cancers are decades down the road, and genetic damage generations down the road. So the thing can be very insidious and could do a great deal of harm to a population without anybody realizing how much harm was being done. If cancers are really delayed congenital defect, look what we're doing by increasing the background. We're increasing the load of defective children. And most of them are mentally defective. And therefore you could be leading to a general deterioration in the mental power of the whole human race.